This video is made possible with the support of my patrons and Super Thanks donors. Click the link to my Patreon in the description down below, or the Super Thanks button underneath the video to help support my work. Thank you so much, and now on to the video. Content note: the subject of this video is gross out comedies and contains mentions and discussions of the humor within such films. This includes offensive jokes that punch down at various disadvantaged groups, including fat people and disabled people. Please proceed with caution.
Welcome to my party, we're just getting started, a life is a dream.
As some of you may know, I have recently become a parent, so I've been spending a lot of time at home, and during that time I've been watching a lot of movies. More specifically, I've been watching gross out comedies that I used to watch a lot as a teen and young adult. And you might be wondering, gross out romantic comedies, what are those? Which is a perfectly reasonable question to ask, since in today's media landscape they're all but extinct, and most people would rather forget they ever existed. But essentially, a gross-out rom-com is a blending of two nowadays considered dead genres, the gross-out comedy and the romantic comedy. The origin of the gross-out comedy is commonly attributed to Pink Flamingos starring drag queen Divine. John Waters wanted to put things on film that weren't illegal on film yet, but should be. I always knew that eating dog shit was going to be the kicker ending, referencing the scene where Divine eats dog shit. Others would follow in Pink Flamingo's footsteps, such as Animal House, American Pie, Europtrip, and Meet the Parents, etc. At the heart of any gross-out rom-com is a love story, but the comedy relies primarily on gross-out humor. For example, in Something About Mary, Ben Stiller's balls get stuck in his zipper, and Cameron Diaz mistakes cum for hair gel. In I Love You, Beth Cooper, Rich steps in a huge pile of cow shit. And in Meet the Fockers, Ben Stiller's mom drops his foreskin into a pot of fondue. As a few commenters put it, they're dad movies, and as another commenter put it, they're like rom-coms but marketed towards men, as men are socialized and expected by society to like more raunchy and inappropriate humor. In addition, the protagonists of these films are almost all male, except for a few exceptions like Bridesmaids. The other elements of gross-out humor include politically incorrect humor, usually jokes that punch down on disadvantaged groups like fat people, old people, people of color, LGBTQ+ people, and disabled people. And as you can guess, the 90s and early 2000s were ripe with all of that, which makes the movies kind of hard to watch nowadays, to say the least. But still, I find myself drawn to them for some reason. They're so bizarre in that they're hard to look away from, and I find myself trying to find meaning in them even if there isn't any. And I was wondering what happened to them, if movies like these could ever come back, and how comedy has changed in a post-Trump, post-Me Too world. So, without further ado, let's go. So this genre is filled with various movies of varying quality, so instead of diving into each and every one, I'm going to be talking about three main ones that all came out within around a decade of one another. The first two are considered pillars of the genre, and those are There's Something About Mary from 1998 and Shallow Hal from 2001. The last one, I Love You, Beth Cooper, is from 2009, and unlike the others, it is a gross-out comedy directed at teens. And before we start, I want to say that I don't think the movies and art in general need to have moral lessons or that we need to sit around in a circle and be like, so what did you learn from this? Because art shouldn't only be seen through an instructional lens or a utilitarian lens of what can we learn from this or what does it mean. Sometimes art can just be. And from that perspective, I was entertained by these films. They're such a train wreck that you can't help but watch in utter shock and awe, which makes sense because that's kind of the reason these movies exist, to shock and bewilder. But at the same time, a lot of these gross-out rom-coms try to have some sort of moral lesson or message because they want to elevate themselves a little bit above just being a gross-out movie for gross-out sake, which is why these movies are so interesting to me. The fact that they feel the need to make commentary to justify themselves in a way in order to balance out the gross comedic elements. So, with all that said, let's start with There's Something About Mary. There's Something About Mary follows Ben Stiller as he tries to find Mary, his long-lost high school crush. Later in the film, he does find Mary with the help of a private investigator. But it turns out the private investigator falls for Mary too, and in fact, everyone in town seems to be smitten with her, some even lying about their identity to get close to her. Mary even had a restraining order on one of the men who was obsessed with stealing her shoes. When Ben finally goes down to Palm Springs and tries to confront her about his feelings for her, he realizes that the pressure he and the other guys have put on Mary to choose one of them is unfair, and he pulls his hat out of the race. Mary realizes Ben is the one for her, and the two kiss and walk into the sunset. The end. This movie comes up on a lot of top 10 gross-out comedy lists, and rightfully so, as some of the humor is just downright disturbing, like when Matt Dillon as Pat Healy drugs Mary's neighbor's dog and then tries to resuscitate it using an electric cable, only for the dog to set on fire. Honestly, pets getting electrocuted or hurt in general should be on a gross-out comedy bingo card. It happens that often. But the parts that don't hold up really don't hold up, unsurprisingly. For example, Mary's brother Warren is disabled, and that's all played for laughs. Even though it's shown in the beginning of the movie that it's wrong to mock someone like Warren, the movie still uses this stereotype of a disabled person as a comedic gag. Not to mention that him being disabled is seen as inherently bad, like Mary's the perfect girl, but her brother's disabled, and therefore she A. isn't as perfect as she seems, and B. her brother is seen as an obstacle the men have to overcome, not someone to empathize with and understand. Though again, it is shown that Ben Stiller likes Warren and is kind to him, unlike the other men in Mary's life, but in reality he's really just doing the bare minimum. Next, Lee Evans as Tucker pretends to be disabled in order to get closer to Mary, and to I guess garner sympathy from her. He pretends to use crutches when in fact he doesn't need them and is a pizza delivery guy, not a British architect. And for some reason, this movie really likes to showcase how Tucker can't navigate the world with his crutches, and that's the joke. It's just really uncomfortable. I guess the joke could be that he's so horrible at using crutches because he doesn't actually need or use them when he's not around Mary, and this could be a form of foreshadowing for the audience. But then they show him practicing with the crutches in a way that will garner the most sympathy from Mary, so he's basically doing it all on purpose. But I'm not here to point out that the movie is bad, offensive, and politically incorrect, or that it hasn't aged well when of course it was just as offensive at the time it was produced, because we know all of that. We know that comedy is the fastest genre to age, and age poorly. What I do want to talk about is the message of the movie, because believe it or not, a lot of these gross-out rom-coms still have messages they want to get across to their predominantly male audience. The message of There's Something About Mary is that all of these men only want to get with her because she represents some idealized version of a woman. They're infatuated with her, but don't even know anything about her. And instead of just getting to know her one-on-one as they all pretend to be something they're not, and go as far as stalking her to find out her favorite movie, when they could have just asked. The movie does condemn the men in the end for their mistreatment of Mary, but Mary still decides to choose Ben Stiller's character, even though he hired a PI to track her down. I originally thought the movie was going to make Mary aware that the men were stalking her and that she'd do something ridiculous on purpose to try to throw them off and see how far they'd take their respective ruses, kind of like in How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days. But instead, the stalking is a reveal. So the message aimed at the men watching is just be yourself and don't be a creep. Be a nice guy like Ben and you'll get the girl. But Ben Stiller is still a creep for his own infatuation with Mary, but I guess he gets a pass because he lets her go, and she's the one who goes after him in the end. And this is a pattern in all gross-out comedy movies. The message is simultaneously, don't idealize women and put them on a pedestal, but also, as long as you're nice relatively when compared to other men, that's enough to win a girl over.
All straight to the face. I'm taking 6 shots, are you coming with me? I'm taking 6.
Shallow Hal is probably the most contentious movie out of the three, and that is because of its controversial premise. The movie centers around Hal, a man who is constantly going after women who are out of his league, and thus missing the great women right in front of him because he's too obsessed with outer appearances. But after a meeting with Tony Robbins, he begins to see ugly women as beautiful, and therefore his dating horizon has been expanded. However, his friend Mauricio lifts the spell that Robbins had cast, and soon Hal sees the women for who they truly are, ugly. And thus, it's up to Hal to decide whether he's going to continue to date Rosemary, portrayed by Gwyneth Paltrow, for what's on the inside, despite her outward appearance. So as you can probably see, there's a lot to unpack here. Mainly this idea that there's a thin person inside of every fat person waiting to break free, and that even though you're ugly on the outside, you're beautiful on the inside, and that's what counts. And though that seems like a nice message, it doesn't really coincide with the actual film, which still sees ugly people as butts of various jokes. If ugly people are just as beautiful people, why spend so much time and effort mocking them or having us stare in horror at them? And I think I should point out here that there is no such thing as objective beauty, and that no one is really ugly, and Shallow Hal continues to uplift this idea of objective beauty, even though they say that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. The film still enforces this binary by saying yes, the women are ugly, but they're beautiful on the inside. What Shallow Hal does get right is that they point out that beauty is a social construct, and is relative. Hal has been conditioned to only consider certain traits as beautiful through advertising and various other media outlets. A small message in Shallow Hal is telling the audience to deconstruct our standard of beauty and to be critical of the media we consume, but it's kind of hard to take that message seriously when the film itself is fine making jokes out of what they consider to be ugly people. Saying that they're beautiful on the inside doesn't hide the fact that you're still saying they're ugly on the outside. In fact, rather than just hiring regular-looking actresses to play the ugly reveal actresses, the film purposefully uses prosthetics and makeup to make them look even uglier, when maybe it would have been more poignant to just have the reveal be that they're average-looking women. As Nathan Burstein wrote in the Harvard Crimson in 2001, the obvious uglification of female cast members leads no authority to the filmmaker's alleged attempt to satirize American pop culture's insistence on seeing only perfect faces and bodies. In addition, it's only the female actresses who get this uglification treatment, whereas the male cast just get to be themselves. With the exception of Mauricio, who was born with a vestigial tail and his paint-on toupee, all of the other men don't get the uglification treatment. That's saved for the women. The only way I can describe I Love You, Beth Cooper is that it's someone's weird fetish come to life. The fetish being, I want to relive my nerdy high school days where I get the hot girl I pined after for 4 years. And I guess that's fine in and of itself, but the way they shoot Hayden Panettiere, the aforementioned hot girl, is just so uncomfortable. There's even a shot where the protagonist, the nerd with the heart of gold Dennis, gets to look up her skirt by accident, but it's all in good fun, right? As a side note, Dennis is just a carbon copy of Leonard and Howard from The Big Bang Theory, so that's nice. His friend Rich is also basically Raj in that he's in touch with his feminine side and is alluded to being gay, and that's the joke. Later, he comes to the conclusion that he might be bisexual, but is still straighter than Dennis, who is still a virgin. There's other weird fetishistic scenes where the teenage girls do a striptease for the boys in the locker room, but the joke is that Dennis misses out on it because he's escaping his bullies. In another scene, Beth Cooper's friends purposely seduce Rich into sleeping with them in order to prove that he's not gay, but at the end of the movie, like I mentioned earlier, Rich comments that he might be bi. Hayden Panettiere was only 20 in this film, while the actor who played Dennis was 28, and yet she's supposed to be the one who looks old for her age, and he's supposed to look like an actual teenager. It's just so weird. Anyway, the film centers on Dennis, who on graduation day decides to confess his love for Beth Cooper in front of the entire school. After the ceremony, Beth and her friends decide to go over to Dennis's house to make fun of him and his friends in order to get revenge on them for embarrassing her. We get a tour of Dennis's room where a huge poster of Beth hangs over his head, which Beth is rightfully creeped out by. However, Cooper's ROTC boyfriend and his gang show up and start chasing after Dennis and Rich. Honestly, the ROTC goons are my favorite part of this movie because they have no lines and are just there to beat up on Dennis, which honestly is kind of cathartic to watch because he's just such a bad person. Anyway, Beth saves Rich and Dennis from her boyfriend and they drive into the night and go on a wild adventure. Dennis sees that Beth is an adrenaline junkie and realizes he may not like her as much as he thought he did. Beth then confronts him, saying that this is who she is and he can either take it or leave it. The movie has the same message as Something About Mary and Shallow Hal. Don't put women up on a pedestal or idolize them. And in the end, Dennis and Beth don't get together. Rather, Dennis resolves to add her on Facebook. I think what interests me the most about this movie is how Beth and her friends are seen as mean girls. And they do come clean that their intent was to bully Rich and Dennis when they came over to Dennis's house earlier in the movie. But by the film's logic, Beth wanting to get a little revenge on Dennis for calling her out in front of the entire school is the same as Dennis essentially stalking Beth when, no. In the end, she's just reacting to what Dennis did to her, and later finds out how creepy he is and that she's right to have been wary of him. It's not alluded to that Beth has bullied Dennis in the past before either, but rather she just doesn't know he exists. So why should she have to apologize for wanting to react to something that made her rightfully uncomfortable? The scene where Dennis confesses his love for Beth at graduation is like those kind of public marriage proposals where the woman is always put in this kind of awkward position where if she says no, she might face actual public ridicule. The screenplay was written by Larry Doyle, who also wrote the novel the film was based on. He won the 2008 Thurber Prize for American Humor for the book. I haven't read it, but fans do say it's better than the movie, which flopped at the box office. But honestly, if it's written by the same guy who wrote the movie, I kind of doubt that would be the case. But let me know if you read the book down below.
Fuck you, you're lost. We all know that we never really want to.
Overall, I think it's lazy to blame political correctness for the death of any sort of art. Takes like The Office wouldn't be made today because of political correctness really bother me because it makes being more inclusive and sensitive out as a bad thing, and that it's killing entertainment when comedy can still thrive in a landscape where we are more understanding and accepting. But with that said, I do think that the political landscape has changed what we find funny and what we don't. In a world where most people are trying to be more socially aware and reflective, the offensive side of gross out humor just cannot survive. The gross part of gross out humor, like bathroom humor or projectile vomiting and other just unsightly imagery, can still do well, but we don't need to watch movies to get grossed out by stuff anymore. Nowadays, comedy is everywhere. It's not a genre in and of itself anymore. As Willem Mumford wrote for The Guardian in 2017, in recent years, the superhero movie has largely ditched its brooding tone in favor of something lighter and funnier. Witness the exuberant comedy of Guardians of the Galaxy or Spider-Man Homecoming, Atlanta's Donald Glover. The Fast and Furious films have brought in more gags. Everywhere you look, someone's wisecracking. We're living in an all-comedy, all-the-time culture, says Owen Gleiberman, Variety's chief film critic. It's taken over commercials. It's taken over current affairs. We get our news from comedians like John Oliver. Our action films are comedies. Our Marvel movies are comedies. Comedy is in the air we breathe. And in that sense, when you go to see a movie that's just a comedy, that does nothing but trying to make you laugh, it feels thin. Even with a veneer of romance thrown in, gross-out rom-coms just cannot survive. And how could they when even the rom-com is dying on the vine? I also think that because nowadays we see the movies someone likes as tied to their identity and moral character, most people don't want to outwardly admit that they like gross out and offensive comedies. If someone says that Shallow Hal was kind of good or that The Hangover 2 is their favorite film, we might question their character because of the material presented in said films, both of which are highly problematic. As a side note, the Hangover trilogy is just the worst, just like objectively. I hate those movies. But even so, I don't think that just because someone likes The Hangover, they're automatically a bad person. That would be ridiculous. However, I think we should encourage reflection and discussion about why these movies are so successful, why jokes at the expense of disadvantaged groups are funny to people not in those groups, and what the writers and producers are perpetuating. If there's no reflection while also enjoying something highly offensive, then there's a problem. And in the end, gross-out movies and gross-out rom-coms more specifically are kind of dead and have been left in the past, where they honestly deserve to stay. Another few reasons why gross-out movies and gross-out comedies aren't being made anymore is because comedy ages poorly. It's not worth investing in something that isn't going to have staying power. In addition, audiences today, at least according to studios, want event movies. They want something with high stakes and a moral center that stands for something. And gross-out rom-coms just usually aren't built for that. Lastly, studios are making less movies nowadays and are taking less risks. If they are going to make a movie, it better have franchise potential and be tied to an existing property, because if not, they're generally not interested. So if we're not watching gross-out rom-coms to get our laughs, what are we watching? What kind of humor does Gen Z and millennials find funny? Well, I can't speak for everyone, but I think the humor that is really thriving now is cringe humor and just very earnest comedy. For example, the comedy in Brooklyn Nine-Nine focuses on being nice to everyone and helping one another out. Compare that to earlier sitcoms like The Big Bang Theory and Friends, where the humor is ragging on people you're supposed to be close with. Abbott Elementary is another comedic sitcom that both stands for something and also manages to be funny, while also having the characters show they care about one another. Modern Family was known as one of the last great sitcoms, and manages to be funny while not punching down at different groups. Cringe humor like The Rehearsal and even Nathan Fielder's older stuff like Nathan For You, as well as Sacha Baron Cohen's Borat 2, is what gets people laughing nowadays. Eric Andre's Bad Trip from 2021 is also a prank-style hidden camera film that relies on gross-out humor, like uncontrollable vomiting, bringing the genre back for modern audiences. Lastly, shows like Crazy Ex-Girlfriend are able to deal with heavy topics in a lighthearted way, and I think that's what audiences today want to see. We want to see something with a meaningful story made accessible with well-executed jokes and a good sense of humor. So that's the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I for one am happy we've moved past the gross-out rom-coms. But if you ever want to watch one, there are plenty to choose from. Let me know what your favorite comedies are right now down below. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.